Welcome to Web Wednesdays here at H&H Color Lab. Today's class is Adobe Lightroom Exports Made Easy. We're going to be using Adobe Lightroom version 4 today, and I'm going to be switching over to that. And we're just going to be talking about exporting files from Lightroom and different ways you can manage that and how to be a little bit more efficient in that. So let's jump over to the screen sharing portion. Exporting from Lightroom. Basically, export can mean to transfer data in a format that can be used by other programs. So when we're talking about exporting from Lightroom, it basically means we need to get the information from Lightroom so that it can be used elsewhere. That could be by other programs or other people. So I want to start by talking about the first level of export that I think about, which isn't always what most people think about, but it's exporting a catalog. So right now, if we notice, we're in my master catalog, and we can see I have about 28,000 plus images in this catalog. Now, this catalog points to multiple hard drives that have multiple folders that are full of images. I've got most of my images on one external hard drive. Now, if there was a reason that I didn't want to work with this one massive catalog, how would I deal with it? Well, that brings up our first export option that we can view, which is called exporting a collection. I created a smart collection, and which is beyond what we're going to talk about today, but basically it pulled images from across my hard drive. So out of that 28,000 images, I picked 43 images I wanted to work with today. So I'm going to start by just right-clicking on that smart collection and choose export this collection as a catalog. What this is going to do is bring up an export as a catalog dialog box. I've already done this export, but I would give it a name, so I'm going to call this export 3. And I'm going to save it. I have a folder called Lightroom Catalogs where I keep all my catalogs together. So I want to save it into that catalog. And my options are export negative files. That actually copies my original files and saves them into that catalog. That's a good thing to do is if you're moving from one computer to another, say you want to share a set of images with someone else and you want them to be able to work on those high-res files. By exporting those negative files with the catalog, they'll be able to do that. For this example, I don't want to do that. I just want to export all the data associated to those images. And I want to include the previews, which is basically the thumbnails that have been built for that catalog. So I'll just choose Export Catalog, and we'll see in this example it can move pretty quickly. So now I'm going to switch over to that catalog, and actually I'm going to go to the one that I exported earlier and just relaunch. And Lightroom will close down and then open up a new catalog. And now I see I'm still working with that same set of images, but now instead of having a catalog that had 28,000 plus images, I only have 44 images. When I look at each one of the images, I will see that all the metadata associated with each of those images still shows up. If I go into the folder collection, I could still see all the folders on my hard drive, and the ones that are highlighted are the ones that have information that have been brought over. So they've been imported, so to speak, into that catalog. So that's our first form of export, is just actually exporting out a catalog. And that's not something you probably do every day, but it's a good export to know, because it may be that you've brought together a collection of images that you want to do for a marketing piece or something like that that you want to work on at home. That's a reason why I might want to do a catalog export. I could also do that to back up certain portions of my master catalog to go just so I have that separate from my main catalog. The next form of export that I want to talk about isn't really one that most people would consider an export, but it is moving the images from one location to another, and that is setting up our preferences to do an external editing export. There are a couple options for this to use, and it's one of those things that most people may not think through this or understand how to take advantage of it. But we actually have two different sets of sections of preferences that we can do for external editing. The first is the default setting, where we can come in and choose file format like Photoshop, TIFF. We can choose the color space that we want to work with. We can choose the bit depth that we want to work with, and if we're processing from RAW, we can also choose the resolution that we want to export these out as. I use multiple exports to my external editor depending on what my process is, what I'm wanting to do. And my default one is what you see here, a Photoshop format in the sRGB color space, 8-bit at 300 resolution. Now I can set up additional exports right down here. I've already defined two. I've got one, and you can tell by the name, this is a JPEG file format in the sRGB color space. It's an 8-bit file at 300 pixels an inch. I have another one that's a Photoshop document at 16-bit in the Pro Photo color space at 300 pixels per inch. We're going to set up a third one, and I'm just going to set this one up as a TIFF, choose my color space, choose my bit depth, resolution, which I'll leave at 300, and if I wanted to compress the TIFF file, historically, I've had issues with compressed TIFF files and sending those to H&H for printing, so it's something that I don't typically do. Once I have all of those settings configured, I should also mention I could choose to edit those with another application if I didn't want to edit those with Photoshop. Let's say I wanted to send it to Painter or something else like that. I could set that as the application. If you go and choose Adobe Photoshop CS6, you're going to get a dialog that says you've already got this set as an external editor. Do you want to continue? Yes or no? So you do have the option. So I want to set this as a new preset, and I'm going to name it, again, just like we saw earlier, TIFF Adobe 98 16-bit 300. So that gives me the different settings that I have going on in there, and I'll just say create. So now I'll see those three different presets have been saved into this catalog. Those are real handy to use. The other option down here, stack with original, we're going to actually demo this a little bit later, so we'll see how that works. And we can also rename how we see that edited file. So what I have is a custom settings, which comes in and uses the original file name. This little blue box here is called a token, and we can set that up down through this section, and we're going to deal with that a little bit more when we're talking about our file export. And then I'm adding the word edit at the end of it. That will let me know this has been a modified file. So let's look at how this works. We'll take this image right here, and if we come in and we see we've applied a little bit of develop settings to it, we've tweaked the exposure and black point just a little bit. So now when I right click on that image and come down to edit in, I can see I can send it to Photoshop, or I can use any of the exports that I've predefined in how do I want to work on that. So for this example, we're going to go to a 16-bit Pro Photo color space, and I want to edit using those Lightroom adjustments. That will allow these settings that I've configured to be applied to that exported file. There we go. So you'll see that'll flip over automatically and open up that file. Now I just wrote a little action earlier that I'm going to run on this. It's going to add some sharpening to that image and say that's what I like. So this is where I could come in and do my retouching options, anything like that. Save that file, and once that's done saving, because this is a Pro Photo 16-bit file, it's going to take a little bit to save it. I'll close out of it, and we'll come back to Lightroom, and now we'll see I actually have two different versions of that file in my Lightroom catalog. So we'll go back to the main library section and zoom up on those thumbnails, and we'll see we've got that file in there twice. And if we go to the single view, we can see the file now has -edit on it, and it has the extension. So we can go back and forth between those two versions and we'll see those in there. So that's another form of export where you can change different types of options going to an external editor to allow you to manipulate those files. The third type of export is the one that people are most familiar with. I've got my files in Lightroom, I've made adjustments to them, I may have cropped them, I may have done color density types of adjustments, and now I want to export those to take to another application, whether it be to upload them to a social media site, to upload them or bring them into ordering software so that I can have them printed or output, or bring them into a slideshow application. What most people are familiar with is just right-clicking on the image, coming down to export, and just going to that top export option. And this will bring up our export dialog. This has all of the different options we can use when we export a file. So let's go through this dialog, make sure everybody's familiar with everything that's on it, because I find a lot of times people may choose a setting and just go with it because they don't know any different, or they've got a problem with their image files because of a setting that they've set in here. Our first option is we have several different places we can export. We can export an image into an email, we can export it to our hard drive, which is our local computer, or we can export it so it burns to a CD or a DVD. I'm going to primarily work with export to a hard drive. I'm going to actually close all of these options so we can go through them one at a time and be a little easier to see. So the first one we want to look at is our export location. This is where our file is going to be saved to or exported to. We have three different options on that. We have export specific folder. Excuse me. We have export that says choose folder later, which is good for presets. And we have same folder as original photo. So let's talk through these. Specific folder means I can come and say exactly where I want this to export to. Now if I'm doing this as a preset, which is what we're going to end up doing, this is going to export to that same folder every single time. Now that may be handy, that may be inconvenient depending on what we're wanting to do. If I'm only dealing with a couple images and then I'm going to move them somewhere else, exporting to a specific folder could be okay, but why not get them where I want them to go off the bat without having to do another step? Choosing same folder as original folder can be good, but it also can get you into trouble. And why do I mean it can get you into trouble? Well, if I'm exporting, let's say I've made a smart collection of images like I have here on my desktop, where I've got images that are from all sorts of locations across my hard drive. If I export to the same folder as original folder, when I want to find all those exported images, I have to know which of the 20 or 30 or 40 folders I need to browse into. That is really good only if you're working with a file management system where all the images you might be exporting are in the same location when you do that export. So that one's one that I try to stay away from unless I'm in a very specific workflow. Going back to the specific folder, for this example, I'm going to have this go out to my desktop, and it's going to create a subfolder for me automatically called Export Test. The other option here I can say is add this back into the catalog, add it to a stack. I don't use any of those options because once I do an export, I typically don't want to keep track of those exported images in my catalog. I can also say if I have exported these files already and now it says you already have files existing with those same names, what do you want me to do? And you could say choose name for a new name for the exported file, which is really your safest answer, unless you know you wanted to physically overwrite those files. So say you've done an export, you realized you messed something up and you want to do that same export again with the same images, that would be a reason to use overwrite without warning. Our next option is our file renaming. So we can tell it to export our files with new names. And when we choose rename, we can come in and edit this to configure how we want it to rename. In this example, we've got several tokens brought up, meaning these little blue bubbles. So we're just going to remove those and start from scratch. So I may want my files renamed with the original file name. So just by clicking Insert, it adds that up there, and I can see an example of the file that has selected. That's the file name it's going to use. Put a dash in. I might decide that I also want to include the folder that it was in. So I have added that up there, and this may be for a specific workflow that I want to work on. I would have folder name. I could also come in and say, from metadata, I want to add my copyright information. So now we see the file name and then my copyright information, which was embedded in the metadata of the file. And then I might want to put in some custom text. What that means is when I select this, I'm going to be able to configure the text on every export. So I'll press Done, and now we'll see this custom text field comes available, and I'm going to call this Web Wednesday. So we can see that all would show up in my file name. Now that's an extremely long file name, but you're going to get the example out of that. I can save those as presets so that I can use them over and over and over again, depending on what I want to do. The next one is for exporting video files. I'm not going to go into that section today. I don't have any video files in my catalog. Our next would be our file settings. File settings are the file format that we want to export to. So the most common ones that people are going to use most likely are going to be the JPEGs and TIFFs. So if I export a JPEG file, it's going to give me options for the compression value from 0 to 100%. 100% is the least amount of compression, so it's going to be your best quality file. I can choose the color space that I want to export to. The two most common ones that you would export to would be sRGB or Adobe 1998. I can also specify, if I want to limit the size of the file, and that might be useful if I need to send those to a specific upload service or things like that. I'd rather limit the file size a little bit differently than coming in this direction. If I export out as a Photoshop document, again, I can choose the color space and also the bit depth, since a Photoshop document will support 8 or 16-bit. Same thing with a TIFF file. I can choose color space, compression, and bit depth, again, depending on where I need to go. DNG is a digital negative, and this is a good way if you want to export out your camera raw files and include the XMP metadata that goes with those. And depending on if you come with Camera Raw 7.1, it's going to give you all the features in the current version. If you're going to a computer that's on an older version of Lightroom or something like that, you might want to choose one of the older versions on there. The JPEG preview is going to include a small JPEG file in that DNG to allow you to view that. You can choose to have that none, medium, or full size. The fast load data just helps you bring that information up quicker, and it's going to probably work with some other information in the future. So that's something that you might want to look at. Use lossy compression actually compresses down your raw file to a certain extent. I typically don't export DNGs, but what I've been told is that is really you're not going to have a huge trade-off in quality loss by turning that on. Embed the original raw file also includes your original capture as part of that DNG. It's going to make the file size quite a bit larger, but if you ever wanted to go back to the original DNG or the original raw file to say take it into the proprietary camera manufacturing raw processor like Canon's DPP or Nikon's capture, you would want to have that turned on. The last one is exporting original, and this is one that you can get into a little bit of trouble on if you're not paying attention. And we're going to go through, make some different presets and go through some different exports, and this is one of the ones we'll specifically look at. With file settings, I often look at image size at the same time. So if I don't leave the image sizing checked, I'm going to actually get the same size, or I'm going to get an image out that is the same size as my original, meaning whatever the native capture is from my camera, that's what I'm going to have exported, minus any cropping that I may have done. If I turn on the resizing, I have several different options that I can choose from. I can specify a specific width or height that I want exported. I can export to get a specific dimension out of it. I can make that dimension export by a long edge, by a short edge, or by a megapixel size. One of the things that I do, I typically set my exporting up to be defined as a square. That actually is not going to change the aspect ratio of my image, but it makes sure it fits within those dimensions. I could also specify a specific long edge dimension, a short edge dimension, or the overall dimension. In one of the tutorials that I was reading, they suggested that doing dimensions could change the crop of your image. In the testing I've done, I have not seen that, but I would be aware of that and test it out before I did anything specific. If I needed to do a large export, I would be careful with that. The reason I might be looking at this image sizing could be because I've shot with a camera that has a lot more information than I really need to export, or I need to export images specifically to social media, to a website that I don't need a lot of information. Output sharpening. This is really, the two places I would use this would be to sharpen, again going for web, and I might want to increase the amount of that sharpening, or if I'm going to an inkjet printer and going through a different rip, not using the print module within Lightroom, and then I would specify the paper type. If I'm exporting my images to come to H&H, I don't need to turn on that sharpening. I would just use the sharpening that I'm going to set in my develop module. The metadata section lets me include the amount of information I want tagged in my files. It could be just the copyright information only. I don't want to see location information. I don't want to see any camera or EXIF data. I don't want to see any of the raw settings. Copyright and contact information would just be information about the creator of the image, the photographer, and how to contact him. All except camera and camera raw information includes the photographer and contact information, as well as any keywords and rankings that have been applied to the image, or you could choose all. I've had a couple occasions where I just want to do the copyright only because I might be shooting with I might not want the end user to know the type of camera that I'm using, how I captured the image, things like that. That would be more pertinent if I was putting those online. So you just kind of have to think where you're going to go with your images, which one of those you want to use. I do also have the ability to put watermarks on my images, and I can edit that watermark information. And so we can see right now I've put in my name and a copyright symbol as the watermark, and I can specify a lot of different information. For example, I can choose the type of font that I want that to be displayed as. So I'm going to come down here and choose, which one did I want to use? Let's use a black letter. So it's kind of a scripty font. I can choose the style. I can come in and specify the size of that by just dragging those corners to make it larger or smaller. I can choose the color of that. I'm working on a Mac, so my color finder is a little different than if you're on a PC. I have the ability to set opacity, offset. I can choose how the shadow opacity, so I've got a drop shadow on it. I can set up the size. I can fill it, fit it. I can also bring in graphics as I want to, and I can specify where I want that to be saved. So let's come back to size, and you can see I can put it in any of the 10 locations around the image. I can also rotate it if I want to. So that's handy to have, especially if you're going to be posting images online. So I can save that, and I'm going to call that Bentley. I also have the ability to set up post-processing options, and this is really handy if I want to export and after export open them in another application. So I may have created a droplet that would automatically run ImageNomics portraiture across all the images. I could say open in Photoshop and have Photoshop configured to automatically run actions or things like that on those, which I don't have set up on my computer right now. So let's go through and set these and create a preset and look at how to use those. So first off, on export location, I'm going to say choose folder later. Next, under file naming, I'm going to go ahead and just go with the original file name. Keep that in there. File settings, I want to export to a JPEG. I'm going to set this down to about an 80% compression. I'm going to also resize these images, and I'm going to use this for social media. So I'm going to say about 500 pixel dimension is going to work for me. Because this is going to go for social media, I'm going to sharpen for screen. On metadata, I just want to put my copyright information only, and I do want to apply my watermark. Once all that is correct, I'm going to press Add and save this as a preset. So I'm going to call this preset social media. And when I press Create, we see it shows up over here on the left. So let's do another one. I'm going to say rename. And actually, I want to modify that one now that I've done it. I'm going to say Edit, File Name, and I'm going to put dash social media so we can see that in there. And add that again. And call it social media 2. Now let's go into our next one. Let's say we need to do proofing. So I'm going to come in here and just rename this proof. And I'm only doing these just so we can see when we do our exports, we'll be able to tell the difference. So proofs, I might take that up to 90%. And for a 4x5 proof, I know that a 1500 pixel dimension is going to work quite nicely. I'm going to uncheck output sharpening. I'm going to go ahead and include all the metadata, and I don't want to put my watermark on that. So I'm going to call this one proof. The third one that I'm going to do, again keeping my export location the same, rename. I'm going to call this one high res. Specify that at 100%, uncheck resize to fit, and add that one as well. So I've now created basically 3 different presets. We'll remove that one. So I've got a high res, a proofing, and a social media. So let's cancel out. Oops, I want to do one more. We're going to do this one as original. Because we talked about exporting as an original and what that would do differently. And create. Okay. Now, let's start by going through and looking at how each of these would work. We're back to our green leaf image. Remember, we had modified that in Photoshop. So let's come in and choose export, and now under our export for our user presets we see each of those options that we chose earlier. So we're going to choose export original. Let's go into that same folder and it'll export out that file as our Photoshop document. So that's our first export. So what we'll see when we come into here, I've got that Photoshop document, which is what type of file that was. And it will have our layers intact on it. And we see that on our layers palette. So that worked as we wanted it to. Now where that can get you into a bit of trouble is if I come in and export out a raw file, like this is a NEF file from a Nikon, it's going to export out a new NEF file. So again, export original, and shows that same location. When I come and look at it now in my exported file, I'm now going to see that raw file. Now in this case, because I'm going to Adobe Bridge, it's going to read the XMP data associated with that image, and so it would apply those settings to that. And I just had a question about pixel size, and we'll get to that right at the end. That'll be a little bit better place to fit that. Okay, so we've talked about export original. Let's look at a different image. Oh, this is one more one to look at. If you're using Lightroom to work with your JPEGs, and in this case when we look at the develop module, and we can see that we've applied a black and white effect to this image to have it look this way. If I choose export original, this is a real important one to be aware of. So export original. Let's go look at that exported file now. We'll see it's going to look right there. It's going to look black and white in Bridge because Bridge, because of this little circle, is reading the XMP data. But if we look at that image within Finder, which since I'm on a Mac is what it's going to show me, it's not going to show that metadata applied to it. It's going to show that image in color, and that can cause some problems. Let's see if I can find it. There we go. So we can see that actual image was exported not as black and white but as color, and so that can mess you up if you're not paying attention when you're doing your exports. So keep that in mind when doing export original. Okay, our next thing that I want to show you, I'm going to grab multiple images here, and the thing to understand that's really cool about these exports is I can come in and say export my proof files. I'm going to save them into that folder, and we'll notice we're going to get a progress bar up here saying export 9 files. While it's exporting, I can select those same images and come in and say export social media files. I'm going to send those to the same location. Now we'll notice we're going to get 2 processes or 2 operations running up here at the same time. I'm going to do one more just for fun. I'm going to say export, oops, not original. I want to export high res. And I now have 3 processes running up simultaneously up here. We have 3 different lines. So that is something that you want to kind of keep in mind, is you can export multiple images at the same time. So now if we go look at in Bridge where they're exporting to, remember we had some named as proof, we had some named as social media, we had some named as high res, so we can see all of those are being exported in there. Also notice that the pixel dimensions I have showing up under each one, and it's matching those based on the criteria that I set up when I defined those exports. So Lightroom is actually spitting out 3 different sets of images all at the same time as we're going through here, and you can kind of track the process looking at that bar. One of the things I would recommend is look at your workflow, set up presets for the types of things that you use most often, and by just using that right-click export option, you can spit those out every single time and they're going to come out the same. Spend some time looking through the presets, understand how those work, understand some of the options in presets, and that will go a long ways to making your workflow go a lot quicker. As always, from everyone here at H&H Color Lab, thanks for attending today's web class. We hope you got some good information out of that, and look forward to seeing you in another Web Wednesday real soon.